The banquet hall was bathed in golden tones, and soft music filled the air. It was Chiara and Matteo's wedding, a celebration full of love and elegance. Giulia moved through the hall with a glass of wine in her hand, smiling at familiar faces, but feeling an emptiness that stubbornly lingered. As she watched Chiara dancing with Matteo, a thought crept into her mind. Will I ever have this? Is it really possible to feel this kind of connection? Chiara approached, bringing Matteo and another man with her. Giulia, I want you to meet Luca. He's been Matteo's friend since childhood. Luca was tall, with a warm smile that seemed to light up the room. He extended his hand to Giulia. Pleasure to meet you, Giulia. I've heard so much about you. Giulia laughed, trying to hide her nervousness. I hope only good things. That depends, Matteo joked. But I'm sure you two will get along. Giulia and Luca started talking while Chiara and Matteo returned to the dance floor. The conversation flowed naturally, surprising Giulia. They talked about work, travel, and favorite movies. Luca seemed genuinely interested in everything she said, and every so often, she noticed him looking at her, as if he were trying to uncover every layer of her. You're an architect? She asked as he spoke about a recent project. I am, but honestly, I think sometimes I choose architecture just as an excuse to travel and explore new places. What about you? You seem like someone who knows what they want. Giulia chuckled lightly, but her eyes showed no humor. If I knew what I wanted, maybe my life would look very different. Luca frowned but didn't press. Maybe figuring out what we want is the most interesting part of the journey. Later, when the slow music started, Luca held out his hand to her. May I have the honor of this dance? Giulia hesitated for a second but accepted. As they danced, the closeness made her heart beat faster. He was attentive, observant, and there was something about him that made her feel safe. Are you always this charming? Or are you trying to impress me because we're at a wedding? She teased. I'm only like this when I'm in front of someone who impresses me, Luca replied, looking directly into her eyes. When the night ended, Luca walked Giulia to her taxi. He seemed reluctant to let her go. I'd love to see you again, he said, almost like a confession. Giulia hesitated, but something inside her encouraged her to say yes. I'd like that too. Luca smiled, handing her a small piece of paper with his phone number. I hope you'll call. As the taxi pulled away, Giulia looked at the paper in her hands, and for the first time in months, felt a spark of something new. At home, Giulia threw herself onto the couch and stared at the ceiling, still holding Luca's paper. Am I ready for this? She murmured to herself. Her phone vibrated, and a message appeared on the screen. It was great meeting you, Giulia. I hope we can do this again soon. Good night. Giulia smiled, feeling a warmth she couldn't ignore. As she turned off the apartment lights, one thought crossed her mind. Is Luca different? Or will I end up ruining this too? The first few dates between Giulia and Luca felt like scenes from a movie. Luca always chose special places. A hidden little restaurant in the streets of Milan, a cafe with a view of the city, or even an old bookstore where they spent hours flipping through books. Luca was attentive in a way that disarmed Giulia. He remembered details, the coffee she liked, her favorite author, even the way she played with her hair when distracted. Are you always like this? She asked once, while they walked through the park after dinner. Like what? Luca replied, laughing. Too perfect. Luca stopped, looking at her with a soft smile. Not perfect, Giulia. Just interested. She averted her eyes, feeling a slight discomfort. Why was it so hard to accept that someone could like her, without expecting anything in return? As the weeks passed, Luca's dedication became even more evident. He was the kind of person who made sure to open the car door, ask about her day, and call just to check in. Yet, while Luca gave his all to the relationship, Giulia felt a barrier within herself. Though she liked Luca, she avoided opening up completely. You seem distant today. Luca commented during dinner one evening. "I'm just tired," she quickly replied, changing the subject. Luca smiled, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. He realized that no matter how much he tried to get close, Giulia kept something hidden, like a fortress he didn't know how to climb. One day, Luca planned a surprise weekend getaway. He took her to Lake Como, booking a small chalet overlooking the water. Giulia was charmed, but felt an odd pressure at the same time. "You thought of everything," she remarked, looking around the impeccably decorated room. "I wanted it to be special," Luca replied, hugging her from behind. "You deserve this and so much more." However, during dinner that evening, something seemed off. Giulia, without realizing it, started to nitpick small details. The wine was too strong, the food a little salty. Luca listened in silence, but inside he felt a pang of unease. Later, as they sat on the porch, he finally spoke. "Giulia, I do all this to see you happy, but sometimes it feels like nothing I do is enough for you." Giulia turned to him surprised. "Luca, I didn't ask you to do all this. It was your choice." "I chose it because I love you," Luca replied, his voice firmer now. "But Giulia, have you ever wondered why it's so hard to accept that?" Giulia froze, feeling Luca's words hit her like a blow. She didn't know how to respond. That night, while Luca slept beside her, Giulia lay awake staring at the ceiling. His words echoed in her mind. Why is it so hard to accept that? She knew Luca was right. No matter how much he tried, she never allowed herself to fully receive his love. But why? The day after the trip to Lake Como, Giulia decided it was time to revisit Anna. She entered the therapist's office with a mix of anticipation and vulnerability. Anna greeted her with a warm smile. "Giulia, it's good to see you again. What's on your mind today?" Giulia sat down, crossing her legs nervously. "It's about Luca," she began. "He's amazing, kind, thoughtful. He does everything to show me he cares. And I just keep pushing him away." Anna tilted her head slightly, observing Giulia. "What do you think makes it hard for you to accept Luca's love?" Giulia hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe it's because it feels too good to be true. Or maybe I don't think I deserve it." Anna leaned forward. "When you say you don't deserve it, what comes to mind? Is there something from your past that this reminds you of?" Giulia looked away, her voice soft. "My parents. My father was always distant. My mother, she was strong, but I think she was always waiting for my father to let her down. And eventually he did. It's like I'm repeating her story without meaning to." Anna nodded. "You're carrying a script you inherited, Giulia. It's not yours, but it feels like it is. Would you like to explore this further through a family constellation session?" Giulia agreed, and Anna set up the pieces on the table. One piece represented Giulia, another Luca, and the remaining pieces represented her parents. Giulia immediately noticed the dynamic. Her father's piece was distant, almost falling off the table, while her mother's piece stood close to Giulia's, as if protecting her. Luca's piece, meanwhile, was on the edge, trying to reach Giulia but blocked by an invisible wall. "What do you see here, Giulia?" Anna asked. Giulia stared at the pieces for a moment. "I see my mother. She's always been there, strong, but she never let herself be vulnerable. And my father. He was physically present, but emotionally, he was never there. I think that's why I always expect people to leave. It's safer to keep them at a distance." Anna rearranged the pieces, bringing Luca's closer to Giulia's. "And how does Luca fit into this?" Giulia's voice trembled. "He's trying to break through the wall. He's not like my father, but I don't know how to let him in." Anna spoke gently. "Giulia, it's okay to let someone in. Luca's actions show he wants to be part of your life. The walls you've built protected you once, but they're not helping you now. Can you tell the part of you that's afraid to trust what you feel about Luca?" Giulia closed her eyes. After a moment, she said quietly, "I want to trust him. I want to believe that he won't leave. But I'm scared. Anna encouraged her to breathe deeply. Trust isn't about eliminating fear. It's about moving forward despite it. Luca seems to understand your fears. Maybe it's time to share them with him. Giulia nodded, her expression more determined. I'll try. That evening, Giulia sat down with Luca after dinner. Luca, she began hesitantly, there's something I need to tell you. Luca looked at her, concerned but attentive. Of course. What is it? Giulia took a deep breath. I've been keeping you at a distance because I'm scared. Scared that if I let you in, you'll leave. Just like my father left my mother emotionally. It's not fair to you, and I know that. But it's hard for me to shake this feeling. Luca reached for her hand, his gaze steady. Giulia, thank you for telling me. I can't erase your past, but I can show you that I'm not going anywhere. All I need is for you to trust me, even if it's a little at a time. Giulia's eyes filled with tears. I want to trust you. I just need time. I'll give you all the time you need, Luca said, pulling her into a hug. Giulia and Luca arrived together at Anna's office. For Giulia, the space felt familiar, almost comforting. But Luca appeared uneasy, adjusting the collar of his jacket and glancing around, as if preparing to step out of his comfort zone. Anna welcomed them with her usual calm demeanor. Giulia, it's good to see you again. And you must be Luca. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. Luca shook Anna's hand, his gratitude evident. Thank you. I'll admit I'm a little nervous. But Giulia has told me a lot about you. Don't worry, Anna said, leading them to comfortable chairs. This is a space for discovery, not judgment. We'll work together to understand what's happening between you two. Anna began with Giulia, who seemed more at ease. Giulia, how would you describe what brought you both here today? Giulia hesitated, but eventually looked at Luca before speaking. I think we're stuck. Luca is wonderful, but no matter how much he gives, I feel like I can't fully receive it. And I know that hurts him. Anna nodded, then turned to Luca. And you, Luca? How would you describe your experience? Luca sighed deeply before responding. I love Giulia, but sometimes I feel drained. I try to show her in every way that I'm here for her, but it feels like it's never enough. That makes me wonder if the problem is with me. If I'm not enough. Anna observed them carefully, then suggested they explore this dynamic through a family constellation exercise. Giulia, you're already familiar with this process, but for Luca, it might feel new. We'll use symbolic pieces to represent yourselves and the significant people in your lives. This will help us visualize what might be influencing your relationship today. Giulia quickly chose pieces to represent herself, Luca, her mother, and her father. Luca, after some hesitation, positioned pieces for himself, his mother, his father, and his younger brother. Once both configurations were laid out, Anna studied them. In Giulia's configuration, the piece representing her mother stood at the center, with Giulia and Luca on opposite sides, unable to fully connect. In Luca's configuration, the piece representing his mother was also central, with Luca and his brother close to her. The piece for his father was distant, almost out of the picture. Anna asked a pivotal question. What do you feel when you look at these configurations? Giulia spoke first. My mother was always the center of everything. My father, he was there, but never really present. I think that still affects me. It's like I can't trust that someone will truly stay. Anna nodded. And how does this reflect in your relationship with Luca? Giulia looked at him with teary eyes. I think unconsciously, I expect him to leave. So I keep a wall up to protect myself. Luca squeezed her hand, clearly moved by her words. I never wanted you to feel that way, Giulia. But now I understand why you act like this sometimes. Anna turned her attention to Luca. And you, Luca? What do you feel when you look at your configuration? Luca stared at the piece representing his mother, so central, and the piece for his father, so distant. My mother was always at the center. After my parents separated, I felt like I had to take responsibility for her, to take care of everything. My father, he was there occasionally, but he was never truly present. I think since then, I felt like I have to do everything to make things work, to hold it all together. Anna nodded. Luca, you learned to give completely to those you care about. That was an act of love, but it became a heavy burden. How does this dynamic play out in your relationship with Giulia? Luca turned to Giulia, his voice filled with emotion. I think I try to do everything for her, like I did for my mother. But sometimes, I feel like I'm waiting for her to reciprocate in the same way. When that doesn't happen, I get frustrated. Not because she's wrong, but because I feel exhausted. Anna gently rearranged the pieces to represent a more balanced dynamic between Giulia and Luca. What's missing here between you two is balance in giving and receiving. Luca, you've become so used to giving that you forget to allow yourself to receive. Giulia, on the other hand, struggles to trust that it's safe to receive because she's never felt that someone would truly be there for her. Both listened in silence, visibly reflecting. Anna continued, you two have love, and that's a powerful foundation. But you need to create a dynamic where you both can give and receive in harmony. It's not about demanding, it's about allowing. As they left Anna's office, Giulia and Luca were visibly emotional, but something had shifted. Giulia and Luca were sitting on the couch in her apartment, sharing a simple dinner of pasta and wine. The session with Anna still echoed in their minds, and both knew this was the time to start applying what they had learned. So, Luca began, twirling his fork thoughtfully. Do you think we can make this work? Giulia looked at him, offering a small but sincere smile. I think so. It's not going to be easy, but I want to try. I really do. Luca smiled back, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. And what if we stumble along the way? Giulia laughed softly, her nervousness evident. Then we'll get back up. Together. Luca nodded, and for a moment, a comfortable silence enveloped them, something they hadn't experienced in a while. In the following days, small but meaningful steps showed the beginning of their progress. Giulia worked on accepting Luca's gestures of love without resistance, and Luca learned to respect her need for space. One afternoon, while they were grocery shopping, Luca placed an expensive bottle of wine in the cart, casually commenting that he wanted to make something special for dinner. Giulia glanced at the price tag and reacted instinctively. Luca, that's too expensive. You don't need to spend so much just for me. Luca frowned slightly, but kept his tone calm. Giulia, it's not just for you. I also like doing special things. And honestly, I think we deserve it. Giulia felt the familiar urge to argue but stopped herself. Anna's words echoed in her mind. Accepting what the other offers is not weakness. It's balance. She hesitated but finally said, Okay, thank you for thinking of something special. Luca smiled, a mix of surprise and satisfaction. For Giulia, this was a small step, but it felt significant. Later that evening, during dinner, Luca brought up a delicate subject. You know, Giulia, I've always thought I needed to do everything for both of us. But after the session with Anna, I realized I've been trying to fill a void that isn't even mine. Giulia set her fork down, curiosity flickering in her eyes. What void, Luca? He sighed, staring at his wine glass for a moment before answering. My mother. After my parents separated, I felt like I had to take responsibility for her. It was like I had to keep everything together to make sure she was okay. And I guess in some way, I've brought that into our relationship. And it's not fair, to me or to you. Giulia reached out, touching his hand gently. Luca, I never wanted you to carry that burden. And I know I need to change too. I'm trying to trust that it's safe to receive, that you won't let me down. They looked at each other in silence. And in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't just love, it was understanding. Despite their small victories, progress wasn't always linear. A few weeks later, Giulia had an exceptionally stressful day at work. When Luca surprised her with a homemade dinner, instead of appreciating the gesture, she snapped. "Luca, I didn't ask for this," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "I just wanted to come home and be alone." Luca froze, clearly hurt, but replied calmly, "I just wanted to help. If you need space, that's okay. But could you tell me that in another way?" Giulia saw the disappointment in his eyes and felt a pang of guilt. She remembered Anna's advice about recognizing the other person's efforts. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice softer. "I know you did this for me. I'm just overwhelmed. But thank you for caring." Luca's expression softened, but the moment highlighted how much work they still had to do. Determined to address her struggles, Giulia booked an individual session with Anna. "Anna, why is this so hard?" she asked, exasperated. "I feel like I'm making progress. But then something happens, and it's like I'm back where I started. Luca is being so patient. But I'm afraid I'm going to push him away." Anna listened carefully before responding. "Giulia, change is a process. You're working to rewrite patterns you've carried for years. That doesn't happen overnight. What matters is that you keep trying and communicate your intentions to Luca. He needs to know that you're committed to this." Giulia nodded, feeling slightly reassured. "I just hope he stays by my side while I figure this out." Anna smiled. "Luca seems like someone who values the journey. Trust that he's here because he wants to be." That evening, Giulia decided to surprise Luca with a simple but thoughtful gesture. She prepared a cozy dinner, set the table, and lit a few candles. When Luca arrived home, he was visibly touched. "This was unexpected," he said, his voice full of emotion. Giulia shrugged, but her eyes betrayed her sincerity. "I realized it's my turn to give. And more importantly, to accept what you give without pushing it away." Luca hugged her tightly, holding her longer than usual. "This means more to me than you know, Giulia." As they sat down to eat, there was a lightness between them that they hadn't felt in months. Later, as they sat on the couch, Giulia rested her head on Luca's lap while he absent-mindedly played with her hair. She stared at the ceiling, reflecting. "Do you think we'll be able to find balance?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luca kissed the top of her head before replying, "I think we're already on the way. And as long as we're both willing to try, that's what matters." Giulia closed her eyes, feeling more at peace than she had in a long time. For the first time, she believed that their love could be different from the patterns of the past. As Luca drifted off to sleep, Giulia remembered Anna's words, balance in giving and receiving. It's not weakness, it's connection. She knew there would still be challenges, but she was ready to face them, one step at a time. The relationship between Giulia and Luca seemed more stable in the weeks following their renewed efforts to grow together. Small gestures and moments of vulnerability began to strengthen their bond. Giulia worked on letting Luca in, and Luca learned to give without feeling the need to overcompensate. But as Anna had warned, change is not linear. Life often tests progress, and one such test came on a rainy morning. Luca was sitting on the couch, reading emails, when Giulia brought over 2 cups of coffee. He looked up with a slightly strained smile. "Thanks," he said, setting his phone down. Giulia noticed his expression. "Something wrong?" she asked, sitting beside him. Luca sighed. "There's a new project at work. They need someone to travel to Rome for 2 weeks to support the team on site. And, well, I'm the best fit for it." Giulia froze for a moment, holding her coffee. Luca rarely traveled for work, and the idea of him being gone for 2 weeks unsettled her. 2 weeks? She asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. Luca nodded. "Yeah, I know it's sudden, but it's a great opportunity. Are you okay with it?" Giulia forced a smile. "Of course. It'll be good for you." Luca studied her face, sensing her unease, but decided not to press. "Don't worry, I'll call you every day," he said, leaning over to kiss her forehead. As Luca packed his suitcase that evening, Giulia felt a growing sense of unease. She knew it was irrational. Luca wasn't leaving her forever, and he had been nothing but supportive. But the whispers of old fears crept in. What if he realizes he doesn't need me? What if he changes while he's gone? When Luca stepped out of the room to take a phone call, Giulia glanced at the half-packed suitcase. The sight of it made her chest tighten. By the time Luca returned, she had composed herself. "You've got everything you need?" she asked casually. "I think so," he said, smiling. But he could sense her worry. "Hey, Giulia," he said gently, sitting beside her. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" She hesitated before answering. "Yeah. I mean, it's just 2 weeks, right?" Luca took her hand in his. "It's okay to feel nervous, but nothing will change between us. You can call me anytime, and I'll call you as often as I can." Giulia nodded, but deep down, she wasn't convinced. The next morning, Giulia accompanied Luca to the train station. As the train approached, she felt a lump forming in her throat. "Promise you'll message me when you get there?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Of course," Luca said, pulling her into a hug. "I'll miss you." "I'll miss you too," Giulia replied softly. As the train pulled away, Giulia stood on the platform, watching until Luca disappeared from view. The emptiness she felt surprised her, and old insecurities started bubbling to the surface. What if this distance grows too much? What if he realizes he's happier without me? In the first few days, Luca called often, updating her on work and asking about her day. But as the project demanded more of his time, the calls became shorter, and his messages less frequent. Giulia tried to rationalize it, but her mind began to wander to worst-case scenarios. One evening, after not hearing from Luca all day, she called Chiara for support. "Chiara, I know it's ridiculous, but I can't stop thinking that he's avoiding me. What if he meets someone else? What if he decides not to come back?" Chiara listened patiently before replying. "Giulia, you've been doing so well. Don't let these old fears take over. You know this isn't about Luca. It's about your past." Giulia sighed. "I know, but it's hard to turn off that voice in my head." "You've already started learning how to trust, Giulia. Remember that Luca loves you, and he's shown that time and time again." That night, Luca finally called. Giulia answered, trying to mask the tension in her voice. "Hey," she said, forcing a smile. "Hey, sorry I didn't call earlier," Luca said, sounding genuinely apologetic. "Today was crazy. How are you?" Giulia hesitated before speaking honestly. "Luca, I know you're busy, but when I don't hear from you, my mind starts to spiral. I start imagining things that don't make sense, and it scares me." Luca was quiet for a moment, then his voice softened. "Giulia, I'm not going anywhere. I know this is hard for you, but I need you to trust me. And more importantly, I need you to trust that you're enough always." His words touched something deep within her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe them. "Thank you for saying that, Luca. I'm trying. I really am." "I know," Luca replied, "and I'll remind you of it as many times as you need." In the days that followed, Giulia focused on herself. She resumed individual sessions with Anna, used the alone time to reflect, and even started journaling her thoughts and fears. She realized that trusting Luca wasn't just about him. It was about learning to trust herself. On Luca's last night in Rome, Giulia found a small note he had left in her drawer before leaving. "I'll always come back to you." She smiled, holding the note close. When Luca returned, Giulia was waiting for him at the train station. As he stepped off the train, she ran to embrace him. "I missed you so much," she said, holding him tightly. "I missed you too," Luca replied, kissing her gently. As they walked home hand in hand, Giulia looked up at him, a newfound confidence in her voice. "Luca, I realized something while you were gone. I've been scared of losing you, but I finally understand that this fear isn't real. It's from my past. It's not about us. And I promise I'll keep working on trusting both you and myself. Luca stopped walking and turned to her, his eyes filled with emotion. Giulia, you have no idea how much that means to me. We're in this together, and I'll always be by your side. That evening, as they sat on the couch sipping wine, Giulia raised her glass. To new beginnings, and to having the courage to trust. Luca clinked his glass against hers, smiling warmly. To us. As they toasted, Giulia felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. The next morning, she found herself looking at the note Luca had written. Inspired, she wrote her own affirmation and placed it on the mirror. I deserve love. I choose to trust. For the first time, she believed it. It was a gray, rainy morning, and the sound of raindrops tapping against the apartment window filled the quiet space. Giulia and Luca were still adjusting to living together, finding a rhythm in their shared routine. Giulia stood in the kitchen preparing coffee, while Luca sat on the couch scrolling through his phone. A heavy sigh escaped him, catching her attention. Luca, is everything okay? She asked, bringing 2 cups of coffee to the table. He looked up with a faint smile, but didn't fully meet her eyes. Yeah, it's just something came up at work. There's a conference in Rome next month, and they want me to attend. It's a great opportunity, but he hesitated. But what? Giulia asked, sitting across from him. It's a week-long conference. I'd have to leave again, he said, watching her reaction carefully. Giulia froze for a moment, though she trusted him more than before. The idea of him leaving brought an unexpected wave of unease. A whole week? She asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Yeah, I know it's not ideal, but it could open doors for some exciting projects, Luca said, his tone hopeful but cautious. Giulia nodded slowly, forcing a smile. Of course. You should go. It's a great chance for you. But her voice betrayed her anxiety, and Luca noticed. Giulia, he said gently, reaching for her hand. Are you really okay with this? She hesitated, then shrugged. I mean, it's just a week, right? I'll be fine. Luca squeezed her hand, sensing her hesitation but not wanting to push. As the conference approached, Giulia felt her anxiety grow. While she didn't doubt Luca's commitment to her, old fears whispered in her mind. What if something changes? What if he realizes he's better off without me? The night before his departure, as Luca packed his bag, Giulia lingered in the doorway watching him. She wanted to speak up, but couldn't find the words. Do you think you'll have time to call while you're there? She asked, finally breaking the silence. Of course, Luca said, smiling. I'll call you every day. And don't forget, you can call me anytime, too. Giulia nodded, but her chest felt tight. The next morning, Giulia accompanied Luca to the train station. As they stood on the platform, waiting for his train to arrive, she couldn't shake her discomfort. Promise me you'll send a message when you get there, she said, her voice tinged with vulnerability. I promise, Luca replied, pulling her into a hug. I'll miss you. I'll miss you too, Giulia said softly. As the train pulled away, Giulia stood there, watching until it disappeared from view. She felt a familiar emptiness creeping in, though she tried to dismiss it. For the first few days of the conference, Luca kept his promise. He called in the evenings, sharing stories about the sessions and asking about her day. But as the schedule grew busier, his messages became shorter, and their calls less frequent. By the 4th day, Giulia hadn't heard from him at all. She tried to tell herself he was just busy, but her mind began to spiral. What if he's losing interest? What if I'm not enough? That evening, overwhelmed by her thoughts, Giulia called Chiara. Chiara, I feel like I'm going crazy. Luca hasn't called all day, and I can't stop thinking that something's wrong, she admitted, pacing the living room. Giulia, Chiara said gently, you've been doing so well. Don't let these fears take over. You know Luca cares about you. I know, Giulia sighed, but it's hard to stop that voice in my head. The one that keeps telling me I'm not good enough. Luca has shown you time and time again that he's different, Chiara reminded her. Trust in what you've built together. Later that night, just as Giulia was getting ready for bed, her phone buzzed. It was a video call from Luca. "Hey," he said, his face lighting up the screen. "I'm so sorry I didn't call earlier. Today was non-stop, and I didn't get a chance to breathe." Giulia hesitated, then decided to be honest. "Luca, I understand you're busy, but when I don't hear from you, my mind starts racing. I get scared that something's wrong, even if I know it's not logical." Luca's expression softened. "Giulia, I'm here. I love you, and nothing is going to change that. I know these fears are hard for you, but I need you to remember that we're in this together. You're enough always." Giulia felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you for saying that, Luca. I'm trying, really. I know you are," he said with a reassuring smile. "And I'll remind you as many times as you need." The following days were smoother. Giulia kept herself busy, reconnecting with her hobbies and journaling her thoughts. She realized that while trusting Luca was important, learning to trust herself was just as crucial. On Luca's last evening in Rome, Giulia opened a small note he had left on her bedside table before leaving. "I'll always come back to you." She smiled, feeling a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in a long time. When Luca returned, Giulia was waiting for him at the station. As he stepped off the train, she ran to him, wrapping her arms tightly around his neck. "I missed you so much," she said, holding him close. "I missed you too," Luca replied, kissing her softly. As they walked home hand in hand, Giulia looked up at him, her voice steady. "Luca, I realized something while you were away. I've been afraid of losing you, but I know now that fear isn't about us. It's about my past, and I'm ready to leave it behind. I promise to keep trusting, both you and myself." Luca stopped walking and turned to her, his eyes filled with emotion. "Giulia, hearing you say that means everything to me. We're in this together, and I'll always be here for you." That evening, as they sat on the couch sharing a bottle of wine, Giulia raised her glass. "To growth, and to trusting in love." Luca clinked his glass against hers, smiling warmly. "To us." For the first time, Giulia felt a profound sense of peace. The fear that had once dominated her thoughts was quiet now, replaced by hope and a belief in the future they were building together. A sunny morning bathed Giulia and Luca's apartment in warm light. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air as Luca hummed softly, arranging breakfast on the small kitchen table. Giulia entered the room, her hair tousled, still shaking off sleep, but a peaceful smile graced her face. "You seem particularly cheerful this morning," she said, grabbing a cup of coffee. Luca grinned playfully. "Why wouldn't I be? Today's a celebration. A big lunch with all our friends and a surprise at the end." Giulia raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A surprise? What kind of surprise?" "You'll see," Luca said mysteriously, taking a sip of his coffee. Later that day, their apartment was alive with laughter and chatter. Chiara and Matteo were there, along with a few of their closest friends. Giulia watched the scene unfold, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. For so long, she had carried the weight of her insecurities, but now, there was a lightness she never thought possible. At one point, Chiara pulled her aside, her eyes gleaming with affection. "You're glowing today, Giulia. Did you notice?" "Glowing?" Giulia asked, laughing lightly. "What does that even mean?" "It means you look happy." "Truly happy," Chiara replied, squeezing her hand. "It's like you've finally found what you've been searching for." Giulia paused, letting the words sink in. "I think I stopped searching," she said softly, "and started accepting." Chiara beamed. "I'm so proud of you. You deserve all of this." After lunch, as the group was finishing dessert, Luca stood up, clinking his glass to get everyone's attention. "Everyone," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Thank you for being here today. It means so much to us to share these moments with you. But before you leave, I have something special to share." Giulia looked at him, her curiosity turning into surprise. "Luca, what are you doing?" He walked over to her, took her hands in his, and knelt down in front of her. Gasps and whispers filled the room as Giulia's hands flew to her mouth. "Giulia," Luca said, looking deeply into her eyes. "These past months have been a journey, one filled with challenges, growth, and so much love. You've shown me that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real. And you've made me a better man just by being yourself. I can't imagine my life without you. So I have to ask, will you marry me?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Giulia. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded quickly, her voice trembling. "Yes. Yes, Luca, I will." Luca slid a simple yet elegant ring onto her finger, and the room erupted in cheers and applause. Chiara and Matteo were the first to embrace them, followed by their other friends, creating a whirlwind of hugs and congratulations. Later that evening, after the guests had left, Giulia and Luca sat on the living room floor, surrounded by empty wine glasses and dessert plates. Giulia looked at the ring on her finger, turning it slowly in the soft light. "You planned all of this?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. With a little help from Chiara, Luca admitted, chuckling. Giulia leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice tender. "Luca, I never thought I could feel like this, so complete. And I know it's because of you." Luca turned to her, cupping her face in his hands. "No, Giulia. You did this. You found the courage to face your fears, to trust, to let love in. I was just here to walk alongside you." Giulia smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Maybe, but I couldn't have done it without you." As the night stretched on, they talked about their future, travel plans, a home of their own, and tentatively, dreams of starting a family. Each word felt like a promise, a step toward the life they were building together. Giulia reflected on how far she had come. "For so long, I let fear hold me back. But now I see that love isn't about perfection. It's about courage. The courage to give, to receive, and to trust in what we're creating together." Luca pulled her closer, his voice a gentle whisper. "And we have courage in abundance." The next morning, Giulia woke up to the soft sunlight streaming through the curtains. She turned to see Luca still asleep beside her, his expression peaceful. Slipping out of bed, she went to the bathroom and looked at the affirmation she had written weeks ago on the mirror. "I deserve love. I choose to trust." Taking a marker, she added another line beneath it. "And now, I choose to build." With a smile, she returned to bed, curling up beside Luca, ready for whatever their future held.